is Daniel James Sharp. I am the editor of The Freethinker. Today I'm joined by Jacob Mchangama, head of the Future of Free Speech think tank, a Danish human rights and free speech activist and author of the excellent 2022 book Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. Today, or the day this interview is released, is the 20th anniversary of the publication of several cartoons of the alleged Prophet Muhammad by the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten. So today we're going to discuss that and the state of free speech in Europe and beyond 20 years later. So thanks very much for joining me today, Jacob. And I guess we should start with a bit of a recap, a refresher of the Jyllands-Posten controversy. So if you wouldn't mind reminding us of that story and what happened back in 2005.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. So, when I was born, as you said, born and raised in Denmark, which in the early 2000s was a place where I think most people took free speech for granted. It was certainly not something that I thought of a lot at that time. It was essentially a freedom that had been won, and the last sort of threat against it, you'd think, would come from religious authorities or institutions or groups, because in the very secular Scandinavia, those groups had long since lost influence. But unlike me, I think the editor who commissioned the cartoons, Flemming Rose, sensed a disturbance in the force of Enlightenment principles, including those of secularism, that sustained open and free societies. And so he had sensed dangers when, for instance, in 2004, the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh had been murdered on the streets of Amsterdam. Very symbolic assassination, given that Amsterdam was this cosmopolitan capital of the early Enlightenment, famous for its comparative tolerance and free speech. And he was murdered by an Islamic fundamentalist, jihadist, who was offended by his film Submission, which was quite critical of Islam. But there had also been other events around the globe. In Denmark, there had been a lecturer, university lecturer, who had recited from the Quran in class. He was then beat up by Muslims, extremists in Copenhagen. There was a stand-up comedian who had freely admitted that he was too afraid to poke fun at Muhammad, the same way that he would feel free to do about Jesus and other religious figures. And then there was a children's book author who had been unable to find illustrators, because he was doing a children's book about the Prophet Muhammad, and he was unable to find illustrators or cartoonists. And so Flemming Rose decided to, I guess, create this social experiment, saying, I'm going to invite a Danish cartoonist to depict Muhammad in whichever way they wanted to. And a number agreed, though only, I guess, 9 or 8 of the cartoons actually depict Muhammad. Others sort of poked fun at the newspaper itself, and the illustrator, who couldn't find cartoons, sort of accusing him of doing a publicity stunt. The most famous of the cartoons is the one that depicts Muhammad with a bum in the turban, by Kurt Vestergaard. Cartoon is now deceased. And that was published on 30th of September 2005, so 20 years ago, when this podcast is released. And initially, it did not create this huge backlash. There was definitely discussions about it. Some thought that it was gratuitously offensive, punching down on a vulnerable minority. Others thought that it was perfectly in line with irreverent Danish tradition of poking fun at religion. But then events started spiraling out of control because regimes in the Middle East, member states of the Islamic of the Organization of Islamic Corporations, started using the cartoons as a as an important piece in the puzzle for whipping up um, anger in Muslim majority countries. They normally you wouldn't in many of these countries you wouldn't the authorities would not allow protests, but they allowed protests in Syria, Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, and some of them resulted in the attacks on Danish embassies. There was a campaign to boycott Danish goods. Lots of people were killed around the world, and also fundamentalist groups like Al Qaeda got involved, issuing death threats against cartoonist editors who had to go into hiding, live with round the clock security for a very long time. And Denmark as a country came under huge pressure. What was dismaying was that a number of Western institutions also issued statements that were very equivocal, to say the least.
Mm.
Amnesty International, which has a long history of protecting dissenters, religious dissenters, and opposing blasphemy norms, issued this statement, which was sort of on the one side this and on the other side that, and sort of suggested that maybe the cartoons were actually constituted incitement to religious hatred, which is prohibited under international human rights law. The State Department in the US, even though the US has very strong protections under the First Amendment, issued initially a statement also saying that this was sort of religious hatred. The European Union was very equivocal. And so Denmark was very isolated as a small country. But ultimately, our government refused to issue an apology, refused to change Danish blasphemy laws. But the whole affair also became the context for Islamic countries to push for a global blasphemy ban at the United Nations and elsewhere. And so essentially the cartoons and Denmark became the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that wasn't the first such controversy or battle over these ideals. You can go all the way back to Rushdie in '89,
Yeah.
Farag Foda, and it certainly wasn't the last clash between Islam and those ideals either. And as you again, as with the Jyllands-Posten case, people were very equivocal with during the Rushdie case and various others. People were
Yeah.
a bit more concerned about the offence caused,
Yeah.
and the
But
fact
I still think during, I mean, there were definitely people who were equivocal during the Rushdie affair, but my general sense is that the literary establishment as a whole sided with Rushdie, with some exceptions. When it came to the cartoons, there were, Penn, which is supposedly an organization defending free speech in Denmark, for instance, was very equivocal, and some members refused to sign a statement of solidarity with Flemming Rose, the Danish author. Some even argued that the long time dormant Danish blasphemy ban should be invoked to punish Jyllands-Posten, which I think was unfathomable that should be coming from a free speech organization.
yeah,
Uh, and the cartoons have had a long half-life. So there was actually not a lot of traditional media outlets that republished the cartoons in the United States. The affair would be covered by New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, but they wouldn't republish the cartoons, which is quite incredible. When we won't depict the very cartoons that this whole affair is
yeah,
about, and out of what I think is, and this is one of the things that also gets me. It was very often sort of self-censorship on this affair was was portrayed in a way of sort of we won't gratuitously offend, when in reality it might just cover over fear of from extremists. And you can't. I mean, hopefully, traditional media would have the bravery to not subject themselves to sort of the assassin's veto. But I think it's quite pernicious when if you choose to do so, if you say, we don't have the resources to deal with potential terrorist attacks from Al Qaeda or other religious extremists, then at the very least you should be honest about, why
Yeah.
you choose to self-censor rather than portraying it as an exercise of tolerance and equality,
Mm.
because that severely undermines both the threat from extremists and the very principle of free speech that was at stake. Um, and but one of the magazines that did republish the cartoons was, of course, Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical magazine, which has a long history of poking fun at all religious authorities,
Mm.
the Catholic Church, maybe in particular. And so they republished the cartoons. They also published their own irreverent cartoons of Muhammad. They were firebombed in 2011. And of course, in 2015, um, that there was a murderous attack on Charlie Hebdo where 12 people were killed by two members, two brothers who carried out the attack in the name of an Al Qaeda branch, and specifically said that this was revenge for mocking the Prophet Muhammad. And I think it would probably be, you know, it would be difficult to imagine that attack taking place without the Jyllands-Posten affair having sort of kicked off this whole controversy about cartoons of Muhammad.
Yeah. Well, that was the 10th anniversary earlier this year of the Charlie
Yes.
Hebdo shooting, so it's an inauspicious year
Yeah.
for anniversary.
And 5 years later, 2020,
Mm.
Samuel Paty, this French high school teacher who displayed some of Charlie Hebdo's caricatures in a civics class, was beheaded by a religious fundamentalist. And of course, he was showing these cartoons in a class about freedom of expression, and he had explicitly sort of said to pupils that they could leave the class if they were to be offended. And I think that really demonstrates um, the threat to free expression, not so much from governments, though governments have now stepped in, as we can maybe get back to, both in Denmark, Sweden, and the UK, and this issue, but from religious extremists. And I think it's quite, you know a cowardly and intellectually dishonest to describe this issue as one about intolerance and equality, when one side is using cartoons and words, and the other side is using AK-47s and knives. Uh, then it's not a question about equality. It's a question of an open society that where no one has the right not to be offended, versus religious fanaticism that insists that religious dogma is above secular principles of free speech, freedom of religion, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a few cases in recent years in the UK as well. Uh, the Batley Grammar School teacher in hiding for showing cartoons in class, still in hiding, I think, a few years on now. Um, and as you say, governments are increasingly getting involved. Here at the moment, there's lots of talk of a proposed definition of Islamophobia uh, that would be adopted by law, and um, essentially outlawing Islamophobia. And
Yeah,
the way in which this is defined is very worrying, worryingly vague. Uh,
yeah,
so yeah, if you could speak a little bit about the link between religious threats to free speech and hate speech laws and Islamophobia laws, all that sort of thing. So that seems
Yeah.
very pernicious.
So I mentioned the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and their international campaign to ban defamation of religion, which essentially would be like a blasphemy ban, but particularly against Islam under international human rights law. So their idea was to say we need to update human rights norms to say that criticism of religion, especially Islam, is a violation of human rights when in fact, international human rights norms and freedom of expression protects the right to blasphemy. This was something that they managed to get a number of resolutions through the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council until the US and Europe got their act together and defeated these resolutions in 2011. But they also worked on another tactic because under international human rights law, unfortunately, there's an explicit obligation to prohibit advocacy that constitutes incitement to religious hatred. Um, um, so these um, OIC countries have argued that, well, if this is not blasphemy, well, then cartoons that mark religion is a form of hate speech that fall under this obligation to prohibit hate speech in international human rights law. This was something that for a very long time was resisted by Western states, but within the past couple of years, we've seen a quite disturbing development. So in 2017, Denmark actually abolished its blasphemy law. I'm proud to say that I was one of the main campaigners in that. And with that, I actually thought that this debate had been settled, at least within sort of Denmark, which was a very symbolic victory. The country that had resisted the pressure from OIC, that had defended the cartoons, or at least the right to publish them, now finally abolished its blasphemy ban, sort of saying, we will not budge on this. Free speech has supremacy over religious sentiments. But then there were these far-right campaigners who started burning the Quran, and renewed threats against Denmark started emerging. Religious extremists tried to kill some of those engaged in Quran burnings. There was huge diplomatic pressure on the Danish government, and some of the very same politicians who proudly proclaimed the supremacy of free speech back in 2017 now started arguing that we need to reintroduce a more narrow blasphemy ban that punishes um, um, the, um, the desecration of religious scriptures, which essentially is mostly aimed at protecting the Quran. And we've also seen that in Sweden, there was an Iraqi refugee, two Iraqi refugees who burned Qurans as a protest against religious fundamentalism. And they were both prosecuted under Sweden's hate speech laws, even though they had told police that they were going to do these public demonstrations and said that they were intending to burn Qurans. The police showed up to protect them. They were later prosecuted and convicted. And the most pernicious thing is that a few days before the verdict, one of these activists was assassinated. So not only did the state fail to protect someone for exercising free speech, however controversially and offensively it chose to do so, but it also punished that very act, which I think speaks to the failure of moral spine. And in the UK, we recently saw this case where a Turkish national of Armenian and Kurdish ethnicity chose to burn the Quran outside the Turkish consulate in London.
Yeah.
and did so in his own words to fight or to protest the creeping Islamism under President Erdogan's rule in Turkey. And when you read the judge, so he was essentially fined for a religiously aggravated public order offense. And the reasoning by the judge in that case, I think, is quite disturbing, because first of all, he says that this act was in whole or in partially animated by hatred against Muslims, rather than so conflating criticism of Islam and animosity towards Islam as a religion with animosity towards Muslims. In which case, you might argue that Tom Paine was guilty of hate speech against Christians for his writings, and should have been. He was prosecuted, of course, and but also saying that the evidence that there was a disturbance to the public order was proven by the fact that this person who burned the Quran outside the consulate in London was attacked by bystanders, kicked, and so on. And so that is essentially, again, a form of victim blaming, right? You provoke religious offense and you're attacked, and that shows that that there's a threat to public order, rather than saying no. The fact that you are offended does not give you license to attack someone, and we should ensure that the law protects those who protest publicly, even if they do so in a way that is offensive.
Yeah.
So essentially, you could say that a number of Western European democracies have internalized the red lines that the OIC have fought for so long.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's astonishing. The the victim blaming in that case.
Yeah,
Again, it's not unique. It happens all the time, even with people who support um, free speech, or say they do, can often be found saying, yes, yes, it's terrible, this fatwa against Salman Rushdie. But he kind of brought it on himself,
yeah.
that sort of thing. Sadly, nothing new. What is the state actually in the Scandinavian countries of the laws about the desecration of religious texts? I think I think some of them have passed laws about.
Yeah, yeah. So, as I said, Denmark passed this law in 2023, a very pernicious law. Um, uh, and whereas in Sweden they've sort of expanded their hate speech law to now cover this issue, and I guess the same in the UK under sort of public order, specifically saying that that this incident was covered by that. And you wonder whether the same result would have been reached if someone was to have burned the Bible, for instance. In which case, it's probably unlikely that that person would have faced the same consequences from bystanders as someone burning the Quran. Um, so that's quite disturbing, and I think there's unfortunately a strong symbolic element in this. So Sweden is the first country in the world to adopt specific legal protection for free speech in 1766. Denmark was the first country in the world in 1770 to formally abolish and repeal any and all pre-publication censorship. And of course, the UK is a country that has produced some of the most influential thinkers of free speech. Think of the levelers in mid 17th century England, who were at cutting edge of defending free speech, not only from pre-publication censorship, but also for subsequent punishments, both political and religious censorship. They were against, for universal religious toleration and an early form of democracy. Um, think of the authors of Cato's Letters. Think of think of John Stuart Mill. Think of George Orwell. I think all that decision really, and Tom Paine, as I mentioned, go back to 1792 or 1793, and Tom Paine was prosecuted for his uh, Age of Reason, I think, or Rights of Man.
Um, yeah, Rights of Man.
Yeah,
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 for his irreverent comments about the Bible and Christianity, and I think, when you look at the reasoning of it was essentially saying that without protecting the doctrines of Christianity, the lower classes would be sapped in their, the whole um, the basic foundations of the class-based British society would essentially collapse, right? So essentially, it was a way of saying that we need Christianity to be, if I may be a little provocative, to be opium for the masses. If we can't, if we don't have that, then they're going to become demand rights that they don't currently have. They're going to challenge the established order, and that would be disastrous for the basic tenets of society as it was then, which did exclude the lower classes from political influence, which did not extend religious freedom to dissenters, which limited free speech to the upper classes.
yeah. I think, pardon me. I think, although I think with Paine, I think it was in that case, it was really just about the rights of man. He hadn't put his opinions on religion out there yet. So I think
No,
it's,
no, no, it's quite clear. If you read the Attorney General, he states it very clear that actually, what I'm confusing here is, so rights of man is uh, Paine is prosecuted in absentia for rights of man, mostly for his political opinions. What you see later on is that Richard Carlile, an early 19th century campaigner for religious freedom and democracy, is prosecuted over and over again for selling Age of Reason to the lower classes
yeah, yeah,
in on the streets of London, and so that's where you see this very paternalistic reasoning.
yeah, yeah.
So it's essentially the writings of Tom Paine, but at a later stage. You're right about that.
And in his own lifetime anyway, although he wasn't prosecuted for the age of reason, he was certainly shunned and reviled for it.
Yeah, Paine. Yes, definitely.
Um, but so I mean, seems seems to me like the answer to this is no or not much. But would you say have we learned anything over the past 20 years? Have we become more robust or less robust in our defense of free speech? Have we made any progress?
Well, I that was, like I said, 2017. I was filled with optimism. It was the Danish abolishment repeal of the blasphemy ban was actually part of a wave of repeals in European countries. But now I am not so sure. It seems to me that now the trend is towards expanding hate speech laws to cover this type of behavior, and I think that is that points towards a wider free speech recession that also covers open democracies, and that is not limited to sort of religion.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think when we get to the 40th anniversary of Jyllands-Posten, that things will be better or worse?
I'm at heart an optimist. So I think so, or I hope so. I think that it will be when we're some distance away from current events. I think when you go back and you compare, like if you read the parliamentary debates of the repeal of the blasphemy ban in Denmark in 2017 with the parliamentary debates of the adoption of this law against desecration of sacred text in 2023, it's quite clear that there's an astonishing level of hypocrisy and double standards. And I think 10 or 20 years from now, I think and hope that when you read that, it's an indefensible. People will say that was indefensible. The narrow reintroduction of the ban in 2023, and that was a capitulation of values that was a low point uh, in Danish history.
Yeah. Specifically on Islam or within Islam, do you see any signs of progress there? In your book, History of Free Speech, you talk about the medieval Abbasid Caliphate and how it was relatively tolerant and open compared to what came afterwards. Actually, I think you call the great freethinker Ibn al-Rawandi um, a medieval Tom Paine, which I quite like that description.
Yeah, him
Um,
and Al-Razi were I think the earliest sort of medieval free thinkers, and I think it'd be wrong to categorize the Abbasid Caliphate as committed to free speech, but it was certainly a much more open in and fruitful intellectual environment than contemporary medieval Western Christendom.
yeah,
And I think Al-Rawandi and Al-Razi really made some quite daring comments on the relationship between free thought and religion, even if they didn't think about it in terms of rights as we do now. Um, are those ideas likely to gain strength in Islamic majority countries? I don't see a lot of signs of that. I mean, if you look at Saudi Arabia, there definitely seems to be an opening up of the country that the traditional religious Wahhabis are on the back foot, and that the new ruler there is open out there. Sexes can intermingle much more freely. You have modern concerts and so on. But I think it's also true that if you criticize religion, if you criticize the ruler, you will face severe punishments. And Tunisia was, until relatively recently, a country where you could be a bit more hopeful. It's a Muslim majority country where there was more free speech after the Arab Spring. That seems to have been rolled back, unfortunately. So that's a major setback. Turkey was once a sort of good example of a secularist Muslim majority country. Erdogan has done much to roll back that and crack down on speech that offends Islam. Um, yeah, so no, I don't see in the short term good example. Pakistan, you see the blasphemy law there being weaponized to institute the death penalty against religious minorities and heterodox thinkers. So I don't see a lot of short-term optimism in Muslim majority countries. There certainly are a number of brave thinkers within the Muslim majority in Muslim world, both people who are pious Muslims, but also people from that region uh, who maybe are agnostic or atheist, who whose efforts I think we should support. I think someone like Mustafa Akyol, um, a Turkish thinker who's a pious Muslim, but who advocates for free speech, thinks that you should be free to criticize Islam. I think thinkers like that are incredibly important, but it's not clear to me that he represents sort of a critical mass in these countries. Although to a certain extent, it's difficult to measure, right? Because if you don't have free speech in these countries, opinions might be hidden. But we did a survey attitudes towards free speech in 33 countries around the world, that came out earlier this year. And you see Muslim majority countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, country like Nigeria, which has like a 50-50% split roughly between Christians and Muslims. You definitely see a much lower support for the right to offend religious feelings than, say, in Scandinavia. So I'm not overly optimistic.
Yeah, the only exception I can think of might be Iran, which, although still a theocracy, um, I think the vast majority of people there, especially young people, are actually irreligious now and
Yeah,
very
I, I yeah,
anti-regime. Whether that
yeah,
will lead to any change, who knows? But I think the numbers there are quite
yeah.
encouraging on that front if they're reliable.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. That there's a very sort of irreverent tradition, and I mean it. That might be somewhat related to the Abbasid Caliphate, because a lot of the prominent thinkers and philosophers were actually Persians. They were not ethnic Arabs. So there's a long tradition in what is contemporary Iran, um, of sort of philosophy that challenges religious dogma. That is not there to the same extent in sort of the Muslim heartland of the Arabian Peninsula, for instance.
Mm,
So if you compared Saudi Arabians with Iranians, you would like to see that Iranians were much more open to religious criticism than Saudi Arabians.
you know. So I think, well, I'm going to pivot a little bit now. You're resident in the US now, and things are looking pretty grim there in terms of free speech. Recently Charlie Kirk was assassinated, um, and since then, Donald Trump seems to be going after um, the people he blames. The left broadly.
Yeah.
Um, Wants to crack down on their free speech. So yeah, how are things in America, and how do you see it? How do you see things going in the homeland of the great First Amendment?
Yeah, I think it's a pivotal moment right now. I mean, I think there was a sense in large parts of the American population that, um, prior to Trump coming into office for his second term, that elite institutions, universities, traditional media, cultural institutions had all um, abandoned or at least compromised on free speech as a cultural value, imposed uniformity of opinion, purged unorthodox views. And I think that explained some of the appeal of Trump, because he was someone who promised to restore free speech. When you look at Trump's record from his first term, and also just the way he acted as a private individual, frequently suing people, that was maybe not uh, the most you know credible campaign promise. But when the very first day he came into office, he signed an executive order promising to restore free speech and the First Amendment and so on. But just about everything he's done since has been the polar opposite. Um, Gone after law firms who have represented people that he doesn't like, going after universities. And even though universities have uh, undermined free speech, many of them, his is a pretty naked attempt to punish universities unless they conform with ideological red lines favored by the administration. Frivolous lawsuits against media institutions, and now post Charlie Kirk, promises to ban, the radical left as domestic terrorists, and even his Attorney General Pam Bondi saying that hate speech is not free speech. If there was
Yeah,
one thing that characterized um, American criticism of European free speech standard. It was the nebulous use of hate speech laws to criticize or to censor uh, disfavored views. This was a criticism that J.D. Vance, the vice president, made in Munich in an infamous speech, and I think he had an important point. But now the administration that Vance and Trump are heading are essentially taking a page out of the playbook of European democracies, and trying to punish viewpoints that they disagree with some of the same arguments. So this is a pivotal moment for the First Amendment. The First Amendment has already come to the rescue of a number of law firms and universities targeted. It is, but the First Amendment is not in and of itself enough, because as we've seen, media organizations, universities, some law firms have caved under this pressure. They have chosen to settle, um, and even though they could have won cases in court. So I think the First Amendment will be important, and I hope it will be able to withstand the current onslaught. But I'm also afraid that it will not be sufficient if the people who could rely on it in court don't have sufficient spine to stand up against the administration when it puts the full weight of the federal government behind intimidating and punitive retribution.
Yeah, how there's a quite. I mean, as you mentioned, Trump promised to be a great free speech champion, and a lot of people probably supported him for that reason.
Yeah.
So uh, I mean, how do those of us who genuinely care about free speech take a consistent principled stand without being drawn to such obvious opportunists as Trump and other authoritarians?
Well, I think we separate free speech from our political alliances. We try our best to resist the human nature of tribalism, which is difficult, and try to be above the polarization. I have to say, I was encouraged by a lot of MAGA conservatives who, when I looked at on X, for instance, and Pam Bondi's, um, just factually incorrect statements about free speech and hate speech, there was a lot of conservative pushback against that. So that seems to me that even if the culture of free speech in the US is eroding, there's still a critical mass of conservatives who say, no, this is not, even if they agree with the sentiment that people who celebrated the assassination of Charlie Kirk, uh, you know, those those expressions are morally reprehensible, should be condemned. It is not for the government to punish those statements.
Yeah,
So that gives me some hope that there will be pushback, because if you have pushback from conservatives, and especially Trump supporters against overreach, that will send a signal to the administration that it might not actually be politically rewarded for this, and so there might be some restraint. Whereas if its supporters were fully on board with it and they only face pushback from the left, then they might be encouraged to take it even further. Um, of course, one of the problems here is that a lot of people on the left don't have a lot of credibility to begin with, because cancel culture was a real thing on the left. Where you'd be fired from the New York Times if you published an op-ed by a Republican senator, as happened to James Bennett, and there were many other examples of that. And let's not forget that many prominent First Amendment scholars and others on the left have consistently argued that the First Amendment's protection of hate speech, for instance, is a mistake. It's one that is being weaponized against minorities, that protects white supremacy and so on, which not only is a complete um, inverts the actual history of the First Amendment, where persecuted minorities played an outsized role in developing speech protective standards, but also paves the way for the current pushback. Because if you say that the First Amendment should be less speech protective, and the government should have more leeway to punish disfavored speech, then you can't very credibly criticize the Trump administration for trying to do that very thing. And so I think that hopefully it will see a course correction on the left and sort of a return to the civil libertarian ethos that dominated until a decade or so ago. And I hope that there will be a critical mass of Americans across political opinion who can set aside their differences on various issues and just say, we are at a very, very critical juncture in America right now. Let's agree on one thing, that is that free speech um, has to be the most important freedom, because without it, I think violence is going to get worse. Extremism is going to get worse. Right now, I think the First Amendment is really what stands between America and sort of more illiberal authoritarian onslaught against freedoms, even if it also allows for ugly and extremist speech.
Yeah, well, that leads quite nicely into a question I'd like to finish off with. To go back to basics a little bit. Um, why free speech in the first place? I mean, why does it matter? Why is it important? Surely, we don't want to offend people by burning Qurans or drawing cartoons, and social media is largely a sewer of disinformation and bile. So this is the view of quite a lot of people, and what do you say to them? What's the basic fundamental case for free speech
Yeah.
throughout
Well, I
history?
mean, first of all, you might say, well, those people who say that typically have strong views on all kinds of topics. But if you drop them into various other countries, or if you drop them back 100 years ago, the views that they hold on specific issues are very likely to have been censored or banned at various points in time as being offensive, or being sort of corrosive to 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 sort of institutional values. And so you would ask them, would you then also be okay with the views that you hold on certain issues to be banned? And typically people, are not. They think that free speech should protect the ideas that they hold dear, but not ideas that they disagree with. So that might be sort of a pedagogical way to illustrate the benefits. But more generally, I would say that there are various free speech theories and justifications. I don't subscribe to sort of one theory to rule them all. I think there are several important justifications for free speech that are mutually reinforcing. Um, I think you can be in favor of free speech as being essential to uh, democracy, an informed public, in addition to supporting free speech on a dignity-based approach, that free speech protects the dignity of every person. I also think that free speech is the guardian of all other freedoms, and individual freedom as such. If you care about privacy, if you care about gender equality, if you care about um, LGBT rights, well, what's your most important weapon? Assuming that you believe in nonviolence, well, it's going to be speech, right? If you want to campaign for certain issues, if you want to petition government, if you want to um, um, persuade other people of the importance of your cause, you want to be able to write about things. You want to be able to create an organization that is free to engage in expressive activities. Um, so in that sense, I see free speech really as a meta right. Um, and that's why I think it's incredibly important to safeguard it. And I also think you can look at it from empirical point of view. If you look at the number of countries that are becoming more authoritarian, you will see that the democratic indicator that is most negatively affected is free speech. If you use the varieties of democracy data set. On conversely, the minority of countries that are moving to strengthen democracy, free speech is also the democratic indicator that is most positively affected. So I think that is a very strong sign that free speech is this most fundamental freedom for democracy. That if you want to subvert democracy becoming more authoritarian, free speech is the key. Um, Censoring, undermining free speech is key to authoritarian takeover. And conversely, if you want a more robust, resilient democratic state, free speech that enables a civil society, free and open media, so on, is also the key. And then we have interesting empirical data that suggests that in democracies, speech restrictions are actually likely to fuel more than, not less, violence. We have data suggesting that free speech is correlated with more racial intolerance and better protections for minorities. So all in all, I think there's a pretty strong, principled, um, functional, and empirical case for robust, principled free speech protections, and also a very strong historical case.
Which you can read all about in your book, which I
Exactly.
highly recommend. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it on. So, yeah, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope America pulls through this
Yeah.
crisis.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And for any viewers or listeners, I'll be in London in October, speaking at the Battle of Ideas Festival on October 18th and 19th. So some of you are interested, feel free to drop by.
Great. Well, thank you again.
Thanks.